Did you just mute yourself?
Yes.
You did. Good. All right. Welcome to Sound Engagement. We are finally having part 2 of our discussion of Cynical Theories. Woohoo! all of our listeners have been just anxiously waiting, wondering, are we ever going to get to part 2?
I heard many of them haven't even slept.
Yeah, we've been just leaving them hanging by a thread, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I guess maybe we could start just to see what our thoughts are about doing this series. It's more just kind of this is our main topic that we'll be focusing on when it's the two of us, but we do schedule some interviews and we got to work around the schedule of the person being interviewed. So when we have a week assigned, we just plan on plugging those interviews in and taking a break from this, since neither of us have quite the time to devote to doing this every like 2 podcasts every week. But we are going to try to increase the frequency from what's been 1 to 2 a month to something closer to hopefully 3 to 4 a month.
Mm-hmm.
But
I'm actually really excited. Well, I think it also comes at a perfect time. I think we're starting to see, I don't know I want to tell our viewers, Quillette is now canceled from Facebook. And if y'all don't know it, so this is going to be a very important time. Quillette is a free speech, very center, not even center right. They have a lot of, they're dedicated all to free speech. They've was started about 5 years ago by an Australian group, but you cannot find their group on Facebook. So they're purely they're only going to be supported by donors. So if you get a chance, go to Quillette.com, support them. It's really kind of some scary times, what we're living in right now. They're really going after a lot of people. If you disagree, have a different turn, and we're going to hopefully talk about why that may be the case, because I'm excited about chapter 2.
Yeah, no, this was a good chapter to explain how really postmodernism became an activist or a tool for activism. I think that's really kind of their aim in this chapter. But I do think that some of the stuff that's happening, maybe we can just acknowledge right now that we don't know how long sound engagement will be allowed, on Facebook or any of the popular platforms. So even YouTube. So right now we're on YouTube and Facebook. We're obviously not getting enough attention to really worry or bother them too much. But still, if that happens, we do have our website, soundengagementnow.com. That will be our source for, that's where we'll post things and have a little more control. But, even then, Google can just eliminate you from search engine, basically. And so you'd have to go directly to our website to find us. But I think you're going to have to do that more and more as the oppression increases against, conservative thought.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that you use the same language, right? And we'll talk about that, the definitions of, oppression and kind of how it's become more vague. But really, it's just shifting. It's just kind of turning from, one person in power is being overthrown by those who, have a different ideology. It's not really ultimately about race, gender, sexuality, as much as it's about a particular view of those things, right? It's a thought that has to becomes powerful. I don't know.
Yeah. No, well, and also today's chapter is talking about postmodernism's applied turn.
Right.
So we could talk about that. Last time we talked about the theory in general, but today is going to be talking about how, because the point of this is that postmodernism kind of died off and then theory propped up.
Right.
And that's kind of the main point of this chapter. So
what is applied postmodernism?
Yeah, applied. So postmodernism kind of died. I mean, its main thesis of postmodernism is just going to be, in the words of Robin DiAngelo, that there's no objective or no objective neutral reality. So the denial of the objective reality would be it, for postmodernism. So you have myriad of intellectuals from Michel Foucault to Lyotard to Jacques Derrida, I think I pronounced this right now, Lacan, who really kind of right around the 1960s and 70s started to kind of branch off and started to have they take this kind of radical skepticism of postmodernism, because postmodernism wasn't necessarily offering, it was starting to kind of die out in some of the philosophy departments. So they wanted to go from what is to what is ought. So applied turn, they go from the is to the ought. And what they mean by that is that don't focus on what is, because there is a blurring of conceptual boundaries, such as between health and sickness, or truth and belief. There's really the blurring of the boundaries, the number one. Number two, the power of language to construct reality. In other words, my language is the important part of how I construct reality, which is why I can constantly move the goal posts. Kind of like, I'm going to change the verb racism to mean, I'm going to make it mean a noun in this case, or vice versa. It always exists. Racialized, yeah. And then cultural relativism, and then the loss of the individual. So all of that goes from, don't worry so much about the is, because you can't necessarily put the minute you kind of set something in stone. This is what some of the militarized feminists were uncomfortable about, like Judith Butler. She was even uncomfortable with the term postmodernism. She was more concerned about what you ought to do rather than what is. So that's applied postmodernism is what social justice, what we're talking about. Yeah. A lot of the intersectionality, a lot of the racism that we're talking about today, like the activism. The A is for activism kind of book out there. That's for children. Activism. Yeah. So
that's a good overview, really, of this chapter. Basically, a kind of a summary, because it is dealing with all those things. I kind of want to get to them in a moment as well, but I wanted to swing back around to that first, I think it's page 46, where he says that, where they say that a diverse set of highly politicized and actionable theories developed out of postmodernism proper. So it's a diverse set of highly politicized and actionable theories. It was basically trying to take postmodernism and bring it to the street, right? Bring it to an actionable approach to these various challenges of oppression, or of just political or social injustices that we're seeing. So that's really kind of the basic definition of applied postmodernism, is taking it and applying it to injustice, to social injustice, or perceived social injustice. And just like you were saying, I mean, it does get into some of the assumptions of postmodernism about the narrative structure, the narrative hierarchy, and whatever's on top is on top because it has abused its power in order to get there. And so you got to critique it. And so there's this constant critique taking place. But really what we've come to is now we see that postmodernism has become social justice, right? Yeah. And that's essentially what they're saying, is it's gone from the ivory tower of the academic philosophers in France or wherever, right, where whoever was taking this and discussing it academically, and now it's brought it to the streets to say, what can we do socially and politically to fight the oppression?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic point, which is why I got in a debate recently with somebody, and he said, well, when you're debating somebody over LGBT activism or Black Lives Matter, for example, well, Peter, you get too heady, and most of the people that you talk to on the street, they have no idea who Derrida is, and I think you almost have a curse of knowledge here. And it was a good point, he made, but then that's exactly what applied postmodernism is trying to do. They don't because it's preachy, Right. This is the radical element of it. I mean, the first principle is that society, the first belief, it's almost like, in a belief structure, you must believe that, Jesus is the Son of God. Okay, we believe that. We think it's true. Or, Muhammad is the prophet. I'm reading the Quran right now. So in this case, you have to believe just one thing, And just one thing, really, and then you can go out and you can be an activist, and that is that you have to believe that society is formed into, what do they call it, like systems of power and hierarchies,
Right. Yeah.
which decide what can be known and how. Once you believe that, you're gold. You're gold. I mean, it's because then you could look everywhere, and I get in this whether I'm teaching or I'm talking to somebody that wants to do social activism. That is their main assumption. Who are you? A white? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, white man saying this to me.
I was just going to say that's precisely what they want to say. They kind of reject the objective truth, except for that one. Right? That's the one objective truth that we just assume it's a reality, and therefore we can work from there. So postmodernism otherwise is still kind of applied in the sense that we are skeptical, highly radically skeptical about knowledge and beliefs and where they come from. Right. So the next page, he says theory. I keep saying he, but it's they, the authors, Helen, Pluckrose, and James Lindsay. They say theory, therefore,
you're so sexist.
I know, I am. Theory, therefore, explicitly aims to critically examine discourses. This means something specific. It means to examine them closely so as to expose and disrupt the political power dynamics it assumes are baked into them so that people will be convinced to reject them and initiate an ideological revolution. So that's that one assumption we start with, is that political power is baked into the fabric of society, the grid that crosses every sphere. And so ultimately that was the transition from kind of a Marxist idea to more of a postmodern idea, which was not so much just critique the current established definition of things, but to recognize that the current definition permeates everything, and therefore everything must be critiqued and everything must be deconstructed, right? Which, I mean, ultimately, I think Marx it's kind of a natural transition from one to the other. But anyways, that idea, that I think you're right to say that assumption is the one assumption that they all accept and adopt. Once you buy into the idea that this power structure has to be deconstructed, then you can really go wherever you want from there.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I think they did a really good job, like starting with, how the mutation of the theory, how it became social justice scholarship. It started kind of running into some serious problems until they started seeing that maybe we can make some inroad on things like anti-racist, feminist, or LGBT activism. And because what they saw is that if you focus on systems of power and privilege, the minute you go there, you immediately, you could already, and I would not even say Marx as much as Freud, you could start to see this kind of, the reason why I say Freud, because almost like this kind of eatable power desire to actually have power in an almost kind of perverted type of way. And that's just kind of, I mean, the reason why they often want to deconstruct is because they feel very uncomfortable that somebody like, if you're a straight white male, you've had so many years of the power of language, and what your assumption is that somebody that is like a foreigner or an immigrant or somebody who's Black that may have been once a slave, or maybe gay, who is in a cis-normative culture, for example, the way they would call it, you're the one that has actually owned language for all these years. And now we have to deconstruct language so they can be kind of part on equal footing with you. So it really started with, say, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw in her idea of, intersectionality. And like when we had Greg Lukianoff, I mean, he made a really great point. Yeah. That she was right on some of her claims, that you could be a Black female, that not just be prejudiced against as a female, but also you could have prejudice against, you could have prejudice against you as a Black person. And so I guess I'm saying all that because once you go there, you then just start, your job is then just to constantly deconstruct, right? It's from this kind of to develop this kind of new community, of identity out that you could then kind of dispense with other identities that are trying to push their objective claims on top of you. So, I mean, that's from a bird's eye view, that's really where they're coming from. And so anything you say is going to be worked against you, especially based on your, if you're higher on the spectrum per se.
Based on your identity. Yeah. And that's that intersectional, Crenshaw kind of introduced intersectionality, and defined it as, anyways, that was the concept we were discussing with Greg Lukianoff. And I think it turned into what it has become, an assumption that we all have various levels of authority based upon our identity. And there's so many different intersections of our identity. If we're in the oppressor group rather than the oppressed, in our ethnicity, in our gender, whatever other sphere, there's something like 17 different areas. I think that it went beyond that, but there were 17 in Greg and Jonathan's book, The Coddling of the American Mind. And they just had to condense it down to something that was a little more manageable. But depending on how many various kind of intersections you have of oppressed, identity, then you have a greater authority to speak into that. And really, they do kind of talk about that in this book. They have the, I'm not sure exactly which page it's on, but let's just going back when you were talking about the women's studies that they were doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reference there was to initially they were just critical Marxists critiquing the view that basically the oppression of women, or the status of women, is really based upon Western patriarchy. That's largely an extension of capitalism. That's literally what it says there on page 53. And so then Foucault famously rejected that top-down understanding of power in favor of a society-permeating grid produced by discourses. So the idea, I think the way you could explain that is that capitalism would be termed sexist by Marx, but Foucault would say capitalism permeates every sphere of society, and now it impacts not just, it in fact impacts everything. And so it has to be attacked and addressed from all those various angles. And depending on, back to the idea of intersectionality, depending on how many spheres of intersection you have, or cross intersections, you have a greiter power to speak to that. And
we should also say too that it really postmodernism started to die off, and then it kind of got its start back. I mean, really through theories, but it really started with postcolonial. And postcolonial, the founder, according to this, is Edward Said, the founding father of political theory, postcolonial theory, who also drew heavily on Foucault, and who wants to focus on discourses that construct reality. Kind of what we were saying before. For Said, it was not, I'm going to quote right here, it's not enough to simply deconstruct power structures and show how perceptions of the East has been constructed by the West. This is from his book, Orientalism. It was necessary to revive and write history. So postcolonialism also often wants to make history from the perspective of who's giving it. Is it being made or unmade? And this is kind of, where eventually when we start talking about, some other like racial stuff, we'll start to talk a little bit about like how people ask the question, well, who's really writing the history book here? And that actually goes back to the whole concept of postcolonialism. But so postcolonial, which makes sense because then that leads to the, in macro, in counseling, one of the things they talk about is meso, and then intra, and then individual. And the meso is kind of like the culture out here. The intra is like your family, your extended family, and then your interpersonal is your immediate family, for example. And so postcolonialism makes sense that they would have to deconstruct this, the people that conquered, so that eventually you get to the people within, and then the people amongst your own structures that are influencing you per se. So it's kind of like it's permeated. Well,
Well,
all
we'll
throughout. Yeah.
We'll get to
Yeah.
post-colonial theory in the next chapter if we
Good to know.
decide to address it.
Yeah. Right.
So you're absolutely right. You're just ahead of the game here. But so the other thing I wanted to point out on this in that section on kind of the where they talked about applying the inapplicable, applying which they came from the position of women's studies.
Right.
Near the end of that section you have this recognition that categories, and you talked about this earlier, that the recognition that certain categories are required in order to critique the kind of the oppressed, the oppressing class. And so if it's white male, wealthy, Western man, like that has to be critiqued. So you can recognize that category in order to critique it, but really, beyond that, you don't want to define categories. In fact, I think it was Judith Butler, right, that said, you don't define, we have to define the sexes as male and female, but we don't want to define gender. We want to leave gender extremely fluid and address that. So that allows them to then critique, the male-centered, the patriarchy.
Right. Yeah, which is why I was trying not to jump ahead with but the book actually through 52, 53 talks about post-colonialism first, and then it talks about LGBT, and then Judith Butler, how she talks about, even the whole gender performativity, which is just basically behaviors and speech that are, quote, gendered on this person's reality. The fact that I speak loud and, puff my chest or whatnot, and I tell my son to, not whine. That would be an example of like, son, I want you to perform on a particular level, where I might be a little softer with my little girl, hold her, tighter, and say, it's okay, sweetie, may comfort her with her fears. She would say, okay, that's you're just, all you're doing, Peter, is you're just performing. And that's why she was really, she wanted to be very political active, because she saw that as a sense of oppression. And she worked on two levels. Firstly, by referring to reality effects. And then she would call them cultural fictions. These are fictions. How she knew there was fiction, I don't know. This is the problem with postmodernism. I mean, it never actually solves its original assumption. It's like, how did you figure that out? So anyway, I don't want to beat a, dead horse. I don't want to take cheap shots here, but it's true. Right. It's true. I don't want to take a cheap shot, but at the same time, I still want to point that out. And then secondly, because the queer is understood to be that which falls outside of categories. Correct, the queer is really kind of like the free person. Notice I didn't say man or female. It's because they're the ones that actually fall completely outside any kind of category by themselves, used to define male or female. And I've met queer people who go, biological male will go into female bathrooms, dress up in a dress, but may have sexual relations with a female. And I'm like, well, talk to me about that. Well, I'm not gay. This is my attraction, but this person would constantly like stand outside of the categories that was supposedly, defined by them, by his parents or religious community and whatnot. And Butler was really kind of pushing for that. And that was the free person. And we're seeing that even today. I'm sure our listeners can think of millions of examples where that's kind of being defined, where sexuality is now being defined. It's more than just gay versus, when I was growing up, it's either gay or hetero. It's not, and that she would be very uncomfortable with, because now you're putting categories even amongst gay men, for example. So really, it's and
those who are in those kind of fluid categories or undefined, not strictly categorized, then in order to liberate them from that oppression, you have to keep definitions vague. You have to keep things kind of ambiguous, right? In order to allow them to involve themselves in the conversation, I guess.
Which I think is wise, that we always remind each other of the first 4 points, where the first point and main 2 points, which is the power structures, and we have to deconstruct, and then the blurring of the boundaries, the power of language, the cultural relativism, and then individual and universal are trying to obliterate that. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
And they bring that up again in pages 59 and 60 in this chapter. So they take this concept and then they say, okay, now let's look back at the definition that we had. And so we can even turn there now, page 59 and 60. It says the idea of this postmodern knowledge principle, that radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is obtainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism. So here they say, yeah, largely that's held true. Like they have a radical skepticism about objective knowledge or truth, except the one thing that we said, right, is that identity and oppression based on identity are treated as known features of objective reality. So the one objective truth you can stand on is that oppression is based on identity. And we know who the oppressors are based on just the category that they belong to, right? And then you have the political principle, which was dismantle the system in the name of social justice. So dismantle all the grid of society, deconstruct it all in the name of social justice in order to bring about, right, a more fair and equitable society. So
yeah, and to contextualize that, Biden's town hall meeting, was really kind of fascinating at one point, because he was very, very uncomfortable to bring up the Muslims that are being slaughtered in China, and his exact words were, well, it was pure cultural relativism. I mean, it was like, well, I'm uncomfortable condemning him too much because we come from different cultures. So even Biden, our own president, is offering radical skepticism, which is one of the reasons why you'll have like Queers for Palestine, which is an actual group.
Right.
Palestine is probably one of the most oppressive countries in the world right now against gays and lesbians. Tel Aviv is one of the freest, and yet they're Queers for Palestine against Israel. It's just kind of like, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, there's a complete cognitive dissonance, which is why you will have Biden saying he doesn't want to condemn the slaughter of Muslims because it's a totally different culture. And you have to show radical skepticism about objective truth. And this is why you'll often have people completely where I think, the people that will allow certain religions that are very anti-gay, for example, but they're allowed in because I can't, quote, I have to be radical about my skepticism of knowing whether or not what you're saying is, whether or not I have, quote, the truth, because my first knowledge is that you were never part of the discussion. Therefore, come on in. It's like this. And then I like because then after that, it leads to the political principle, which is making sure that your voice always kind of is equal to mine. But you think about that, just as long as the hierarchies and powers are constantly destroyed, but replaced with what, and that's
right. Well, they do go on to the four key themes that you've mentioned as well. The blurring of boundaries, which ultimately comes out in political, in this political principle as elevating lived experience as evidence, right? So we can now tell our story, and that's all the proof you need to see the oppression. There's no, once you start dealing with data and statistics, now you're using, you're coming from a knowledge base that's defined and been determined by the white Western male. And anyways, it's rejected. Yeah.
Well, I love how they made the connection with who was it, Descartes, who said, I think, ergo sum, which is, I think, therefore I am. I don't think I did my Latin. It's up to cogito ergo sum. Yeah, I should know that. I think, therefore I am. For this theory, it's I experience oppression, therefore I am. And so are dominance and oppression. So, I mean, that's the new knowledge today. And, but go ahead. I just wanted to add to that because I think that was a really very important point to make. Yeah.
Well, this really is taking the principles that they set up in chapter 1, which if you haven't watched that, you go back and watch chapter 1, which was a month ago, and that'll help you to understand kind of this base foundation of postmodernism that then is turned into theory and activism. for politics. So the second theme is the power of language, which we did actually talk about this with Greg. We talked about the coddling the American mind and word as violence. That book is excellent on this topic. And I would say even you can refer to your last interview with Cynthia last week on
trigger warning,
with Cynthia Myersberg on trigger warning. The idea that the way we respond to violent words is with potentially physical violence. That's how it was in, for instance, Berkeley, when Milo Yiannopoulos or something went and spoke there. They were like, his words are violence and they're doing harm to people. So therefore we're going to physically harm those who are promoting him. It turned into a riot. Now, of course, not everyone held to that, but I mean, it became a massive riot on campus. And also, if I could add this too, I mean, that's exactly why people are feeling fully justified to totally ruin people's reputation, completely ruin other people's reputation. When James brought up, not James, but who was the guy that we interviewed? Greg. Thank you. I'm thinking not James, Lindsay. Thank you. Sorry, Greg. Yeah, right. When he brought up Mike Adams, the guy from UNC in Wilmington, which I didn't know him, but
so people are feeling fully justified that I could just totally ruin your complete reputation, your political career, and feel justified. Yeah, feel totally justified in doing so which is a form of violence when you really think about it. Maybe not physical, but definitely emotional. I mean, often as a counselor, I can say this, that emotional abuse is sometimes heck of a lot worse than physical at times. But I feel justified mainly because of this discourse analysis and these microaggressions and these trigger warnings that Go ahead.
Well, so that's you just labeled them all. You got safe spaces, microaggressions, trigger warnings. That really is how postmodernism is applied in that theme, the power of language. Then you have the third theme of cultural relativism, which they just basically focus on intersectionality and saying it permeates everything. Now it's become a widespread thing within social justice, and as an assumption that those who have the greatest level of intersectionality have the greatest authority to speak in a situation. And so it's just become the norm that you work from. And man, we'll get to that in a second. I had one thing to say, but then let's just do the fourth theme real quick. And that is the loss of individual and the universal. And they just say they've got to emphasize identity politics, right? And identity categories become dominant, and therefore individuals and universal categories get removed.
And there's a lot. It's funny. I'm teaching child development, and one of the theories talks about talking about a little bit earlier about the meso and the interpersonal, and then the intra, and then interpersonal. And they've proven through this theory that the meso theory is rarely as effective as what goes on in the interpersonal. And these are just they weren't even kind of playing with these games or whatnot. When you look a lot to the science, when you look at when it comes to the sovereignty of the individual, this kind of hits home for me. How postmodernism wants to lose the individual and the universal. I mean, I became really concerned about a lot of this stuff because I am a clinician and I do hear people's individual stories, and the group or the family dynamic or the culture that they were kind of a part of never explained them in a very succinct or helpful or even applicable way that did justice to their own needs and desires, or what their wants are, or and how they clinically got better and improved. I mean, the loss of the individual, I think, is just where you become this kind of total sum into this identity group, and you lose. It's almost like, what is it? I mean, almost like this extreme Gnosticism, which is like you completely lose your sense of identity and become subsumed in this ocean of the group that you're supposedly belonging to, which is really interesting.
And kind of mythical.
And mythical.
Bit.
Yeah.
Well, I think James Lindsay's he's doing work now on some of that, the idea that we have really bought into various myths of identity. I can't remember what he called it. It's in a recent podcast of his. on what is it? Discourses, what
Discourse analysis.
New discourses or something.
Discourses. Yeah. Which is a great blog. Yeah.
Yeah, it's excellent. So yeah, we can come close to wrapping this up here, but I thought on page 62, there's this kind of where he takes he gives us an example of applied postmodernism, and he says this. I keep saying he, she,
they,
and he, sure. They. Z. I'll say Z from now on. Z says this carries.
Or we could. Hey, Gino Carano or Bebop.
Right.
Protect her, man. Yeah, she's our hero now. So she's
awesome. She's awesome. All right. So yeah, they say if what we accept as true is only accepted as such because the discourses of straight, white, wealthy Western men have been privileged, then applied theory indicates this can be challenged by empowering marginalized identity groups and insisting their voices take precedence. So I don't know if you've seen this in your field, like in because now they're talking about applying it in the studies, right? So social studies, social justice scholarship, and this is where they get into research justice. And if we're going to critique the oppressing class, then we've got to remove their voice. We've got to eliminate their theory, and like at least their ability to expound upon it, and elevate the voices of the minorities and the oppressed, and start to, basically promote their work. So they give this alarming proposal demands that scholars preferentially cite women and minorities and minimize citations of white Western men, because empirical research that values knowledge production rooted in evidence and reasoned argument is an unfairly privileged cultural construct of white Westerners. So it takes this objective idea of a theory or a knowledge, and, hey, whoever's teaching it, if it's true, it's true. That's not what they accept. They know if it's a white person teaching it, then they're only perpetuating a like an oppressive worldview. Yeah.
It becomes a genetic fallacy all over again.
Yeah,
and the ad hominem, like who you are and where you came from, invalidates you.
Yeah, and it's
which I heard didn't work out well for Jews and blacks during the 1930s and 40s. Didn't work out well for them, and I don't know why people are thinking it's going to work out for in the future. So never worked out when we tried to apply this principle. We saw a lot of oppression, more significant. Well, and this is the lie of communism right here. Is right here. Like this is exactly it. It's where it feeds off of your compassion, as we were talking about. Go ahead. Yeah.
I just think you're right. If there's nothing true, then it's just very subjective, and we need to listen to lived experiences, and we need to allow those voices to be heard and minimize everyone else. So there's perfect validity to violently protest someone who has a different ideology. And that's the thing. It's not just if you fit that intersection of, class, race, gender, but it's actually if you believe that ideology, right? Like so they don't want diversity of race, in the sense that they, because otherwise you could read Thomas Sowell, you could read Coleman Hughes, you could read people that have a diverse opinion that are in that race, but instead those guys are minimized because they hold to a different theory about knowledge. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the idea. Identity politics has replaced eliminate diversity of thought in that. Just accept.
Well, what's really interesting too, I was just listening to Jordan Peterson's review of with Gad Saad, and it was really good. And Gad Saad talks about how this is like a parasite. When you think of his example is the wasp, the spider wasp, who stings the spider, and while the spider is still alive, and then puts it in its nest, and lays babies. And while the spider is alive, it's getting eaten by all of its babies. It's zombified. And he says this is because the thing about these studies that are going on, there is no peer review, there is no objective to kind of critique. Like when you and I went to seminary, we had a lot of critique from other people that said, okay, Peter, Brad, this is what the scriptures are saying, here's what you're saying. I mean, it was sometimes we were critiqued, at least I was, quite harshly, or hard, and actually didn't mind that. I remember taking a class here in the local university, and the professor getting really kind of banging his table and kept saying to us, what does the text say? What does the text say? And, we were kind of going off in our own little diversions. And I guess the point is that, peer review and objectivity is actually really important to kind of reach some kind of unified theme. And so the reason why he calls it a parasite is that it makes you zombified, because there's no way to falsify your own interpretation by just conforming evidence or alternative explanations. It's just one way or and it
zombified.
Scholars can just openly declare themselves to be activists and not have an ounce. That's what's really kind of fascinating about this chapter, what he keeps going on. You could be a militarized feminist, genderqueer activist, and not have one in 12 years of school, not take one class on the scientific method, on why your papers need to be through peer evaluation, which is astounding to me. That basically what we have in a lot of these, social justice scholarship programs, you don't actually have real scholarship that is being perpetuated. You have pure activism, and that's it. And that's the point. They actually don't want scholarship. They push back against scholarship because that's going back to postcolonialism. That's a Thomastic kind of, Thomas Aquinas kind of view of the world, who looks at things of objectivity. You're looking at it from a Eurocentric worldview, and you're pushing it on us. But, it's the reason why we have these, peer reviews and whatnot is so that we, to basically destroy in-group bias, our own biases with our system one processing, because we are such reactive people that we love, but all of that goes away. So it's only the role of scholarship is purely through advocacy. And that's it. Just advocate. It's not so much on, as you were saying, truth, or whether or not it's true or not true. It's how much of an, quote, impact will you make in this particular community? So how much impact, if you could be the first trans male to female at your local high school, it's not so much that I could just destroy all the competition. We celebrate you because you've destroyed we don't really care about the 3 or 4 girls that completely lost their scholarship. We love how you impacted that particular environment, and that's why we're putting you at the very top. So that's where.
So that's the entire Biden cabinet.
I mean, that's exactly what they're kind of dominate. Yeah, that's the dominant, orthodoxy right here. It's not, the ramifications of some of your decisions as much as how much you impacted this particular place right here. And, you're reading that a lot in through the new academia and the new curriculums. And I think this is such a relevant book. This is such a good book to be going over right now, because I do think we're entering a phase, especially with Biden's administration. I'm going to say something political, but he's already, putting up anti-racism rhetoric. My own field right now has a training next week on anti-racism, where I'm likely going to have to be, just to maintain my license, I'm going to have to not adhere to, but take a training through. I don't know about my license now, but we don't know. This is really relevant. It's not some kind of philosophy that's out there. It's in our schools. It's in our kindergarten classes. And this isn't just me looking, being a conspiracy theorist. Anyway, if you wanted to add on to that, I didn't want to go too long.
No, I'll just close with this in terms of what I'm seeing in the church is the same, that concept of elevating minority voices, minimizing the voices of, so in this case, like we're a Reformed Presbyterian denomination. And so all of that history, all of that theology comes from white Western thought, right? White people, old dead white guys. And so we've now actually introduced questions to incoming ordination candidates, to ask them if they're reading minority scholars, who they're reading and how it's impacted their their understanding or their theology or how they're using it. It's like it's going to just it doesn't end there, right? That's just the beginning of some of this creep into every sphere, right? It's going to begin to question where our theories and our theology comes from. Now, hopefully, if I were an ordination candidate and I said, well, I've read Vodi Bakum on this topic, or, hopefully that'll be allowed. Otherwise, we're doing exactly what others are doing. And we're saying no diversity of thought. No, I don't want it just any minority. I want a minority who is woke, who has a particular view of what the church should be doing in this case. So anyways, that's fairly blunt, but I think it's a little bit, we're on the precipice.
Yeah, we are. Yeah. Concerning times. Concerning. Yeah. Anyway, I know we went longer. We meant to stop at 30.
we want to keep this thing short. We're trying to be a little more concise, but it's hard to do live.
Yeah,
so
it is.
Maybe we
Thanks
just
everyone
stop
for listening. Yeah. Yeah.
All right.
Anyway.
It was fun. Yes.
Until next time.
We'll actually try to do maybe chapter 3 next week if you're available, Peter. I'm throwing it out there, putting him on the spot.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. Let's talk. Yeah, that might be good.
To get this faster. All right.
Okay.
See you guys.